I know.
Tom Kramer received a BFA from the Pacific Northwest College of Art and then went on for graduate studies at the Pratt Institute in New York. He has an extensive exhibition history beginning in the mid-1970s that includes 5 Oregon Biennial exhibitions at the Portland Art Museum, as well as including exhibitions at the Howard Ford Museum of Art, the Watkin Museum, the Tacoma Art Museum, Bellevue Art Museum, and the Boise Art Museum. In addition to a very active studio practice, Tom has completed many commission projects, including costume and set design for Oregon Ballet Theater and Ballet Pacifica. His work has been extremely well collected by private and public collections and is represented in the collections of the Hallie Ford Museum of Art, the Watkin Museum, the Boise Art Museum, and the Portland Art Museum. Tom joined our gallery in 2007, and I'm very proud to have him here and really excited about having his show this month.
Well, thank you very much. You did a great job, Arthur. Thank you very much. Well, thank you all for showing up. I'm really flattered. I didn't know that this show would get any kind of real attention. I think the main thing I thought about with this show was many of you may be familiar with some of my earlier work, and in that work, I talk more about, in my work, in terms of musical references, and I'm a big fan of big scale orchestral music, and I think my prior work was more big scale orchestral, very complicated, very ambitious, months and months to do one piece. This show, the analogy I'd like to come up with, it's more like chamber music, or in a popular music metaphor, it would be more like unplugged, like Let It Be, not Abbey Road. But anyway, this show is more, in that sense, George Johansson gave me a nice compliment. I assume it was a compliment, maybe it wasn't, but he said it was a really successful, modest show, and I said, yeah, that's exactly right. That's what I was thinking about. I was thinking about something less ambitious, less sort of outer space-ish, Stanley Kubrick-ish, and something more down to earth. Because I have been to India 3 times, and any of you who have been there know what an incredibly mind-altering experience it can be. Of course, it can be very difficult too. But I do like to travel a lot. My mother likes to travel a lot. She's the famous Betty Perkins, and she's with John Frisbee right over there, and John Frisbee, right. And this show is heavily indebted and influenced by Shannon Kraft and other artists that I very much respect. And she helped me a lot. I have a very big problem with value in art. And what I mean by value is darks and lights. I've always had a dyslexic thing about that. I don't know why. I have a problem with that. A lot of my work, because of that, it doesn't look good in reproduction. It looks usually really not very good at all. It looks just sort of washed out because I finally figured out, well, I'm just not very good at value. And so, blacks and whites. And Jay said something that really, by the way, he was an incredibly amazing drawing teacher, and he is the one person who really taught me how to draw representationally. So he's, in addition to a great artist, is a great, in my case, life drawing teacher. He really taught me more than anybody else at the famous Museum Art School, which was, I think, when it was the peak, around the time, I was at the later days of when it was a really great school. Now I don't think it's nearly as good, but I'm sort of controversial. Sorry. I always get into myself in trouble. Anyway, we'll leave it at that. That's only my opinion. But anyway, this show is all I'm a native Oregonian. Both my parents, my mother, my dad isn't here. He's still alive too. Are native Oregonians, and I've been to all these places. Every single place in this show I have visited, and it means something to me. And not only do I like it visually, but I like it experientially. Is that the right word? I've experienced the place, and there's something about each place that affected me in a big way. And each piece, I hope, is trying to reflect the kind of light that you experience in these different places. This is Timberline Lodge in the summer. I didn't say that on the tag, I probably should have. But Timberline Lodge on a hot day has a very kind of Swiss alpine feeling. I've only been to Switzerland in the summer and kind of in Zermatt, and has that sort of magical Heidi kind of feeling. This one is supposed to be Timberline Lodge, as if it were one of those snow things that you shake up, one of those toy things in a souvenir shop. So it's kind of a winter wonderland depiction. This is not the top of the mountain. this is the top of the mountain, but when you're up there at night, there's often almost a holographic effect, and you can't really tell where the light's very interesting up there at Timberline. And also I wanted to point out that if you ever do hiking, I go up there a lot, especially in the summer. On a full moon, it's incredibly illuminated. It's like a 20-watt light bulb at night. I mean, you don't need any lights at night to hike at night. This one is Haystack Rock. Everybody knows Haystack Rock. It's a famous place. We always vacationed there when I was a little kid. I also was influenced on that piece by kind of the light of right before the sun goes down. Of course, that kind of light is so typical of what we associate with a Fred Meyer landscape, or kind of kitsch, or something that would be associated with sort of low art. And so, but I realized that sometimes it really does look like a Bud ad, you know, or a Budweiser ad, you know. I mean, or a cool cigarette ad, or whatever. In fact, I really like old advertising a lot. There's so much talent and brilliance compressed into 30 seconds. There's a lot of you get on the internet now, but old advertising from the 60s and 70s is so much fun. The round barn is the only piece from Eastern Oregon. That piece right there, I visited that with my Uncle Bill in Burns. He was friends with Tom McCall. He was kind of a rural person, but very environmentally aware. And I remember we visited that round barn, and it's still there. Now it's a historic monument. That's Crown Point, south of Columbia Gorge. I've always thought of that as sort of a Gothic sort of place. The way I did it, somebody came up to me and said, well, it looks sort of like a citadel from, you know, a sort of a fantasy, what's the word, kind of a story, a fairy tale thing. I think there is sort of a little bit of some of that in some of these pieces, where there's a Grimm's fairy tale-like feeling to some of them. Because some of the places are very otherworldly. Crater Lake comes to mind for that. Crater Lake, those of you who've been up there, it's very high altitude, obviously a major mountain blew out. It's a national park. The Indians believed it was evil, meaning supernatural. Like, don't go up there, don't look at it. I always get a very shining feeling up there. Just something, you know, it's possessed. I'll put it that way. I think some land is possessed, period. Even Forest Park. There's certain parts of Forest Park that have an automatically great feeling every time I walk through them. There are other places, maybe a bunch of Indians were massacred there, and there's a bad feeling. So in this show, long story short, trying to make each place, trying to depict it in a way consistent with how I experienced it. Pinnock Mansion is a very fairy tale-like place. It's Portland's only building. It's a lot like the buildings in France and the Loire Valley, I don't know how you pronounce it. It's kind of outside of Paris where they built those huge, literally, they even knew they were over the top even at the time. They're so expensive to heat that they brought all the supplies in and carriages and only went there in the summer. They didn't even use them. They weren't meant to be used year-round because they were so huge and relentless. Anyway, Henry Pinnock, who founded the Oregonian, built that place, and we all know it. I go up there all the time. Generally, somebody asked me, why didn't you do any modern buildings? And I do love a lot of modern buildings. The reason I didn't do any modern buildings is they're not very interesting to do. They're great to be in, but when you do it, there's not enough. It's like you have to have something going on, and just doing a box is sort of not what I'm interested in. I'm not really a minimalist, you know. I like to really go full on. I usually don't restrain myself very much. I tend to. My flaw is probably overdoing things, you know. And I think it's because I'm really influenced by music. I was raised in a musical family. Relentless classical music all the time, drum in. And I probably wired my brain to, I'm a musical snob, is what I am. And I only like certain isolated pop bands. There are some I really do like, you know, but not that many. when you're, I mean, like Jay, I think Jay and I have one thing in common in this show, that I think we're both in different ways addressing low and high, kind of. You know, I mean, I think I probably just said that in different words, but his work, there's a lot of pop culture imagery and some very traditional high art imagery simultaneous. In these, there's I'm fascinated with both pop culture and low and high culture. And I think that one more thing, and then you can, if you have any questions, you're welcome to ask, but I think it's better to listen to music, like if you like the Beatles, then you can segue right into Bach, rather than the Beatles and then the Beach Boys. I think it's much more interesting to listen to music thematically, you know what I mean? Because George Martin exposed them to the Brandenburg Concertos, and changed their whole career. And then Miles Davis is almost like East Indian music, because it's improvisational music. It's music based on one emotion taken, explored to extreme, and also sort of an altered state of consciousness. Music is kind of a nervous system thing. Art as something that changes your. One artist that does that, or a couple that do it, Mark Rothko. I mean, a really great Mark Rothko is just unbelievable. It's just like a religious experience. I went to the place in Houston, the temple he did. Some Monet, for me, does that, and occasionally Vermeer. But there's some people that, you know, we're all different. We all get turned on by different things. That's the nature of art, you know. But are there any questions? And there's a couple more inventive pieces in there, but we'll just talk in here. You can go in there and look if you want. Any questions?
Tom, a personal question.
Sure.
On the other side, there's a painting I purchased.
Right.
And I want you to tell me how you made it. What steps are involved in this?
Right. I mean, you can all go in there and look at it. The one that Don got was the lighthouse, which is when you go down to Cannon Beach or Seaside. Most of you know, right? Know that town. When you look out, there's a lighthouse out in the middle of the ocean. It's called Tillamook Rock Lighthouse, right? And I've always been fascinated with that place. And so I decided to include that in the show. And so that piece was the most difficult piece in this entire show to do. And I almost debated whether to even put it in, because it's the only piece in this show where I didn't know when it stopped. It just would not, I couldn't stop, or, I mean, I had to just stop. When I stopped, I didn't think to myself, this is finished. I thought to myself, it stopped. And what I did with that one is, when you look at the lighthouse, you obviously are looking at it from like a mile away. So it's kind of, you're looking at it through atmosphere, and the atmosphere is going like that. Does everybody know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
It's sort of like this specific beach kind of light. And I think handling it with a static sort of treatment just wouldn't be appropriate for what I was trying to depict. Therefore, I went on an extreme pointillist route, breaking it into little pieces. And you know, I've said this before, I'll say it again, but an interesting way to unify something is to break something into tiny, tiny bits, to atomize something so much that it unifies it. A literal example of that is like on the beach. There's billions of grains of sand, yet it's one thing. Sand, you know, it's the sandness, it's the beach. But it's also billions of different things. And so this piece was an attempt to unify through fragmentation. And also, it's very 3D in that when you're looking at something like that, you're looking at something through the atmosphere. It's a painting about the atmosphere of what you're looking at more than what you're looking at. So it's clearly lifting from Impressionism. And I think one really interesting thing about looking at original art why people should always have and look at and own original art versus reproductions, is that when you see a real impressionist painting, it's much tougher, much more confrontational, much more interesting, much more, much different experience than on the posters you see all over the gift shops all over the world. It's a very different. My admiration for Monet went so far up when I saw his great paintings in Paris. I know he seems like kind of a safe. He's sort of safe to like Monet, is that he's sort of neutral. He's not particularly controversial. But this show is not controversial and not meant to be controversial. You know, it's boring to always be controversial. It's fun to do something normal.
Everybody wants to be loved.
Right, exactly.
I'm very curious, standing here looking at these, what they look like before you paint them. And how they would read, you know?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, they're done in stages, right? I laminate the blocks, then I draw the composition on the block. Most of these are done from photographs. Then I carve based on the drawing, and then I paint from based on the carving, and then I gild in order to. Somebody asked me, why do you gild? And I said, to unify the information. You know.
So there's a certain point when the carving is finished.
Right.
And does it read pretty much like these? I mean, you can see an image as clearly in just the carving before you start to paint?
I would answer definitely not. Definitely not. I mean, the painting is a big part of making the image come forward. And only if you knew what you were looking at would you be able to tell what you were looking at. Or an expert on the place. You know, I followed the forms of the basic architecture with the carving, and then reinforced it with the value, and then reinforced it again with the color over the value. You know what I mean?
You ever carve back in?
I did on a couple ones in there. I did do that on, it's a great question. I did that on Aniana Gorge. It's a piece in there. I completely recarved the whole center area. That is an interesting experience in that place is so difficult to describe without, with like in a photographic sense, that I basically abandoned photographic means to describe it. And that one is all knife in the middle. All the carving is done with a knife, what's called a bench knife, which is the traditional Native American way of carving, by the way, bent knife. And then the outside of it is carved with a chisel. And that created a scale change. Do you know that? Does everybody know that place, Aniana Gorge? It's a place where there's about 18 different plants that only grow there. And the entire planet only grows there. It's a really fascinating place. Yes.
Tom, I have been looking at your work for many, many years, back to the Jameson Thomas days. And I even remember an exhibition you had at Cinema 21.
All right. Love that place. I got 100 free admissions for that.
Good deal.
I got about 6 months ago.
You're a good man to know. My question is, there must have been a moment, or I don't know how elongated that moment was, when you came to the notion of atomizing the image. And I'd like to know if there is a describable series of influences or an epiphany or whatever that brought you to the place where pointillism and fragmentation and atomization, or whatever you want to call it, became the dominant technique and vision that you were working with. Remember the source code?
Yeah, I do. I can't, I mean, it's a fantastic question, but it's like Gertrude Stein said when she said, what's the answer? And then she went to coma and she said, what's the question? And then she died. It's sort of like, it's such a great question that I can only answer it, speculate. But I think that going to India probably had a huge effect, because for one thing, walking through the streets of Calcutta is like a forest of people, a forest of highly intelligent people with no money, no anything, most of them better educated than most people here. Yet, and you think about all those brains going off, and I do sort of think, it sounds a little nuts, but I think we're a little bit like an electrical system and a chemical system, and you're exposed to lots of different, even animals or plants or whatever. If you become sensitive and tuned to it, you would start absorbing all those things, and it becomes an overwhelming experience. I think it has to do with some kind of ADD thing where there's just so much information coming at you that I can't, I can't think of it any other way other than each little bit of reality represents a separate reality in itself. And also I was really affected by that film that man made about the boy in the canoe and the pond. Do you ever remember that famous movie? I think it's
Power of 10?
I think so. I think some guy in the 50s made it at Chicago.
Charles Eames.
Charles Eames made that movie. I never forgot
What's it
that
called?
movie.
What's it?
It's a Power.
It's called Power of 10,
Yeah.
and I can't remember, I think it starts off in the cosmos. And it's a continual zoom
I remember
shot
that.
before computers and before all the technology that would make something like that
Right, exactly.
easy. I mean, they do it on the news every night now, where you're out in space, and the next minute you're in downtown Cairo or something, with one building. But Eames did it in the 1950s, and it was really startling at that time. So it starts off in the cosmos and ends up in a microcosm.
In his hand, or goes way into the hand, you realize on every level, it's sort of an ecological awareness too. Every level, there's a different world. We're this size, therefore we relate to everything on a certain scale. But if we were a bug and walking through grass, the grass would be like a redwood forest, and or a mouse, then it would be like bushes, would be like these huge. And there were a couple Twilight Zones episodes that dealt with this concept where. One of my favorite ones was these people were just sort of living their lives, and then at the very end, this little girl picks the people up, and it turns out that Earth is a terrarium for a higher intelligence. It's like an experiment I always get the feeling sometimes that we're not just from here. There's some other thing that created humans. I mean, I've read books about it. No one can explain how we came from monkeys to who we are now. Other than there's a few controversial people I've read, like Terence McKenna, who believes it had to do with psychedelic drugs and psychedelic mushrooms, that certain tribes ingested these things and were suddenly, blown out of their minds, had an incredible experience, and then the next level came up. Stanley Kubrick's really interested in that theory. 2001 is the same theory, that something happened that made us become more aware of, we know that we're this little ball in this vast cosmos, right? And that itself, I mean, if you think of outer space and infinity, then the atomization thing becomes I think a logical way to think about it. You know what I mean? It's very intimidating.
Or look through an electron microscope.
Exactly. But in short, I think that movie was a big influence. But sometimes, or is anybody else like this? Sometimes you're exposed to something, right? And then only maybe 10 years later, you realize what you were exposed to. Does anybody know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Edvard Munch put it best. He said, I don't paint what I see, I paint what I saw. You know what I mean? And that's this whole show. It's all memories of the place, yes.
I had sort of a weird connection like that too, because I just bought, your big silver trunk, right?
Oh, yeah, you're the one.
That I-
Oh, great.
That I was super excited about. and Chris brought it to my house, we walked all over, and we walked all over, and we walked all over, because actually, you know, I live in a 1907 house that doesn't have a lot of space. And we ended up putting it down, and then I came back and I looked again, and I thought, this is a really odd connection, because this used to be Cassie Wright's bedroom.
Oh, my God.
I know, who
Did you
used
live
to
in
do your gilding for you,
She
right?
did do my gilding.
Yeah.
Yes, she did. She
And-
died. Did
yeah.
you know her?
Yeah, I did.
Oh, my God, I did.
Yeah, so it was just like an odd, you know, how things are drawn to certain connections about space and time, and it was just like, this is kind of, it felt very odd, but
Wasn't
very
you-
right.
Wasn't you really interested in that, those kinds of things?
Yeah, 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 Yeah.
I find him very hard to
Yeah.
read, but
yeah,
more
Yeah.
interesting to read about.
yeah.
Anybody else, or, but thank you, that's amazing. You
Yeah.
live in her house?
Yeah,
Oh, I
yeah,
didn't know, that's a
yeah,
great house.
yeah, it's a great house, so
Yeah.
it's in her bedroom.
That's incredible.
I know, it was just like an odd connection that I realized after, you know,
Yeah, that
people
was,
liking similar things, being drawn to similar things in the world.
that was a horrible tragedy.
Yeah, it was terrible.
This is a close friend of mine that died in 1998. Never quite got over that.
No.
She was just an amazing person. Anyway, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom.
Good to see you.
Great question. That was a real
Good. Well, I just remember that people changed at a certain point. And I think somebody told me you had him.
Yeah.
Whose name was it?
Oh, he's a great guy.
I haven't seen him. I saw him at Jim Nashville about a year ago. Playing in Hollywood.
I talked to him once on the phone and supported his organization.
You said he had a
Bicycle accident, yeah.
Serious?
For a while, and he's got, last time I saw him, he had a huge beard.
Oh,
I saw it at the
really?
Hank Anders.
Oh.
You're still working, aren't
I
you?
am. I showed Augie Gallery.
Yeah, I'll go to your next show.
Yeah, good.
I just need to hear about you.
Yeah,
I love your
absolutely.
work.
Thank you so much. It's a lot different. It's, I'm working with,
I realize if I smile, then I feel good.
you're a great guy.
It goes backward.
I'm getting, oh, DVD.
Okay,
So the movie. So probably see it.
He has to find a slide projector.
So
Let me know.
Right. To a group. And the only reason I'm saying that is there's already 30 in the group.
yeah, you gotta get a hold of the. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what it is. But I had gone to conferences where people had prepared one talks and couldn't project it. You know, you don't want to go in there and have a bad experience. You don't want to waste people's time. That's another thing. You know, I feel like. You know,
Right.
yeah. Monochromatic, you know, that you really can't see the card. These are funny. They were done in 1911.
Yeah.
You know, in the post-Surratt.
Well, they take on kind of a different feeling because they're in the carvings.
Right.
They were by themselves.
And they seem to be selling pretty well, those little pointless
Yes.
things.
Yes.
Maybe you and I should enter a pointless phase. I'll do, you know, cavalry officers and Indians as little pointless paintings. Maybe they'll sell better. And maybe I'll be able to do it faster.
You know, this business of the small scale and you know, how far you go, it would look like a painting.
Well, then, I guess those guys were the original pointillists, the Romans, you know.
But so small, I couldn't believe it. It's smaller than Seurat's dogs, you know. By the way, I do remember that movie, and as I remember it, the nice thing about it was that it started with the boy fishing. And, and it slowly goes up, and you think, oh, this is interesting. And now it goes back through his hand and into the molecule, which was a very nice way to do it.
Right.
You know, surprised you, at least me, and I think it was meant to do that. It surprised me each time because you thought we're going to stop here, and that was great. And now
We
we're
kept
stop
going
here.
further.
That was great, and then we're going to go down, back down to him, and that was great. And then you're inside. So each step was a surprise.